Each episode, we take apart the claims, moving through advertising, media, AI, e-commerce, and business. The numbers, the sources, the incentives, and the parts everyone else skipped. Because the first version of a story is usually the easiest to share. It is not always the safest one to trust. It requires diligence. This is Deeper Diligence, a podcast from Daypart.
Welcome back to Deeper Diligence. We have me, your usual host, Bogdan. We have Digital Chatvertising, our co-host, who needs no introduction. And we have the amazing Dr. Fu today with us from Fu Analytics. He's one of the most trusted voices in ad tech. Dr. Fu, I'll let you give a quick intro about yourself.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm Augustine Fu. I've been doing digital marketing for a little over 3 decades. I started at McKinsey and Company and then worked on the client side at American Express and then served in 2 agency holding companies, Interpublic Group and Omnicom. And the last 15 years I spent studying the problem of digital ad fraud. So we're going to touch upon that a little bit, but also talk about attribution and how marketers are looking at digital and trying to see how it's performing, how it's driving business outcomes for them.
So you're one of the best guests to talk about this since you really dive deep in it day to day. I want to start the podcast with a quick question about pixel attribution. Pixel attribution, currently, it's the most dominant form of attribution. You put a pixel on your website, it captures all the data that's happening. But why is it the most dominant form of attribution right now and not more complicated forms like multi-channel attribution? Why is that?
Because it's easy. It might even come included with your Google platform buys or Facebook. So just to kind of explain the technical stuff behind the scenes, typically when you run a campaign on Google or YouTube or Facebook and Instagram, they will give you a conversion pixel that you put on your website. So then when someone clicks through from the ad and arrives on your website, they can tell that user came from a particular campaign, right? It was running on Instagram, they saw the ad, they clicked through, and then they arrived on the site. And ideally, after that, the person would go on to make a purchase. So like most things in advertising or digital advertising, the idea is right in theory, but sometimes it might be a little too simplistic and it might be easily gamed by fraudsters who are trying to make the campaigns look like they're working better than they are. So in this case, if everything is fine and there's no fraud, it's a perfectly good way to attribute sales, right? So the question that advertisers want to answer is, what caused my sale and which channels should I invest more money in, right? So obviously, if a particular channel like Facebook ads or YouTube ads are driving visits to the website and ultimately sales and conversions, that means it's performing and they want to invest more in that, right? So they can get more sales and perform and outcomes. But the problem is when you're only using a pixel, it's trying to identify that particular user. And essentially, you're marking the user as either someone who was exposed to the ad or someone who took an action, clicked through on the ad. But I think more advanced marketers understand that a single ad impression doesn't drive a single sale. Right? Sometimes a human might have to see multiple ad impressions. They might have to do a little more research by searching for something, and then maybe they click on a search ad. But a single ad impression doesn't cause a single sale, right? There's many things that contribute to it. So I think at its most fundamental, these pixel-based attribution platforms are just what I call an oversimplistic way of assuming that a particular sale was driven by a particular ad impression. But that's the way the industry has evolved. That's what most people accept as the standard. So that's why it's popular, it's easy. So that's why it's being used so widely right now.
And from your experience, based on everything you have seen, is there an attribution model or a way to attribute that is better than the standard?
Yeah, there are much more advanced models or other things, multi-touch, MTA. The whole point is to see which sales and conversions were caused by which channels. For the lay people, and myself included, I typically do what they call holdout tests or what I call turn-off experiments. So there's one interesting example. This dated all the way back to eBay running this experiment themselves. I think it was like 2011, and they wrote about it in the Harvard Business Review case study. eBay basically wanted to see which of their paid search ads were actually driving sales, both traffic and sales. So what they did is they turned off the entire West Coast to see, meaning the paid spend in the entire West Coast, to see what happens. As it turns out, nothing, because people in the entire West Coast continue typing in the search terms like eBay guitar or guitars on eBay or something like that. So the searches kept coming. So those were not necessarily from the paid advertising. It was simply that the paid advertising was attributed, right? The sales were attributed to the paid advertising. So when you run a turn off experiment, if the traffic and the sales continue, then you know that those were not driven by that particular form of advertising. Now, obviously, it's not that clean, not that clear cut for most people, because I think in North America, some of the largest advertisers, they have so many different forms of advertising going on across every single channel that they really never truly turn off anything, right? So if they turn off digital, they still have TV running, or they might still have radio running. So that way you can't specifically say what caused what, right? It's just too complex. There's too many things going on. So it's really hard to run an experiment scientifically enough to really get at what caused what. But again, that's how I would approach attribution. Pixel-based attribution is not bad. It's just one thing. But I would just encourage advertisers to check it and run some additional holdouts or turn-off experiments so that you can make sure those are actually reporting reality, meaning you're driving incremental sales that you would not have gotten in the absence of those advertising.
I was wondering, based on what you said, it's really interesting since if you perform holdout tests, a lot of companies might be worried what's going to happen. It might impact my sales. I don't want to reduce the pipeline, especially in 2026 when pipeline is the most important thing right now. Everyone's talking about it. And it's important to attribute every single ad to your pipeline, right?
Yeah, the problem you're identifying is very common, right? I hear from advertisers, oh, I have to spend all my budget before the end of the year, or I won't get enough budget, or I won't get as much budget next year. That's actually a really incorrect way of thinking about advertising. So a lot of marketing managers, they're given a budget and they feel like they have to spend it all. But in some cases, I've actually seen the advertiser just save the money, right? So if you have $100 million just using all of that drops straight to your bottom line, right? Because if you spend the $20 million and you're barely getting $20 million of sales, right? If you're getting $20 million of sales, you're literally breaking even. You didn't actually make any profit from spending that $20 million, right? So if you actually didn't spend it, that would actually have a bigger impact on your bottom line. And most marketers haven't gone through that thought experiment. So I would encourage marketers to don't just think about spending it all by the end of the time period, right? The end of the year, the end of the quarter, whatever. It's really, you have to run those experiments to see if those incremental dollars that you're spending as ad budgets are actually driving incremental sales. Again, those sales that would not have occurred in the absence of those ad budgets, right? So yes, there's always this fear like, oh, if I don't spend it, I'm going to lose it. But it's better if you don't spend it if you actually don't know if it's driving any sales for you. It's common sense.
Yeah, I'd like to add, so like I guess with seasonality being a pretty big thing in the ad world, and everyone's pretty much knee deep in Q4 planning at the moment, and I think we do tend to see a lot of incremental spending around the holiday season and Q4. But on the fraud side, do you see any seasonality with fraud that coincides with that kind of volume of spend? Do you see seasonality with fraud?
Huge,
Okay, wow.
huge. And let me explain why. It's super simple reason. Because so many advertisers have to spend their budgets before the end of the year. And they typically focus on the weeks before Thanksgiving and then into Christmas because people are literally shopping for presents and stuff like that. And the advertisers have to use up their budgets before the end of the year. It is basically shopping season for the bad guys as well. Because if you think about ad fraud, the bad guys can manufacture as many ad impressions as you want to buy to absorb all your budgets. So then every advertiser is super happy because they were able to spend in full. Okay. Now, the reality of it is, if you think about digital advertising, the way it's supposed to work is when a person visited a web page like New York Times, when they hit the page, when the page loads, then the ads load, right? So the ad inventory doesn't actually exist before the person actually loads the page. However, in this case, if you think about real publishers or real sellers, there's a finite human audience, right? And a human can't visit 1,000 pages in the same minute, right? They'll probably visit 5 to 10 in the same minute, but you can't physically get a person to see 1,000 web pages. However, with bots and software programs, that's what I meant by you can manufacture as many ad impressions as you need to absorb all the budgets. So we see this towards the end of the year when there's big budgets that have to be spent. We see this towards the end of whatever time period, like the end of the month, we see traffic surges. Why? Because they have to hit their number. They're running behind. Okay, let's go buy some traffic, generate some ad impressions so we hit our number before the end of the time period. So this happens at the end of every month, at the end of every quarter. And there's two other industries that are heavily impacted by this phenomenon, which is they have to spend the budget by a certain date. And that's the movie industry and political. Okay, so in the movie industry, they have to spend all their budgets before opening day to promote the movie. Bad guys love that because, again, they can generate as many ad impressions you want to buy so that they can absorb all your budget. Same thing with political, right? You have to spend your budget to advertise before election day, right? It doesn't make sense to spend it after election day. So in those scenarios, bad guys love it because they can literally manufacture out of thin air as many impressions as you want to buy to eat up all your budgets.
And when we're talking about bad guys or bad agents, who are we talking about specifically? Are we talking about the advertiser? Are we talking about the platforms? Are we talking about the websites that could generate traffic on their website to get them more revenue down in their pockets?
Let me take a step back and lay out a brief history of programmatic, right? So programmatic as a way of buying media really took hold in the early 2010s, right? So 2012, 2013. So programmatic media buying basically means the advertisers are now bidding on every single ad opportunity. Okay, so prior to programmatic ad exchanges, the ad buyers would go to real publishers like ESPN, like Time Inc., like Condé Nast. They would sit across the table and negotiate a media deal with them, right? So you could actually see the people that you're buying the ads from. Then when programmatic ad exchanges came along, you started to lose sight who you're buying the ads from because you would give a chunk of money to the ad exchange and say, go spend it for me. And you wouldn't know ahead of time where your ads are going to end up because you're going to be basically trusting the auction process to then say, okay, we're going to bid on these ad opportunities. And then if we win the bid, then the ad goes to a particular place. But with the advent of ad exchanges, that's what actually created this giant loophole that the bad guys, fraudsters, exploited. So in the early days, most of the fraudsters were operating websites. Okay, so in the very early days of AppNexus, the first ad exchange, the bad guys would simply create tens of thousands of fake websites just using WordPress templates, right? You would just put in some pictures, put in some text content. It really doesn't matter what, right? You just have to have some content to make it look kind of like a website. And then you would copy and paste some code onto the site and start running ads. So with the advent of programmatic ad exchanges, we now created this entire huge opportunity for bad guys to now start selling ads to the biggest of advertisers. Whereas before that, if imagine Boris from Brooklyn, if they went to P&G and say, oh, hey, I have a whole bunch of ads to sell you, P&G will say, who the heck are you guys? We don't know any of your sites. We don't know who you are. We're never going to buy from you. But now when those fraudsters get mixed into the ad exchange, it became easy for them to sell ads by the millions to the largest of advertisers, right? And that's where digital advertising started going south. Okay. So that's kind of the background, right? The fraudsters are the people, even they don't need a lot of technical skill, right? Script kiddies could easily set up 10,000 WordPress sites. They could also clone mobile apps, right? So a lot of the dollars are going to mobile apps now. So in those particular cases, think of the flashlight app, the alarm clock app, a whole bunch of kids coloring apps. They're all just running ads in the background. Okay, that's how they can generate lots and lots of ad impressions. And you don't need 50,000 flashlight apps because you have a flashlight built into your phone. So really, all of these mobile apps are not really downloaded by people. They are really created solely for the purpose of running up as many ad impressions as possible. So that's how the fraud works. And then just to close the loop on the middlemen, right? So if you're an ad exchange, if you're an agency, you make more money the more volume that flows through your pipes. So again, you're not the one committing the fraud, right? You're not the one making the bots or making the fake apps, but these ad exchanges are certainly going to look the other way because they want as much volume to flow through. If we catch 50% fraud, if we catch 90% fraud, that means we just chopped off 90% of their revenue. So they don't want that, right? They're very happy to look the other way. They're very happy to pay for legacy fraud verification companies that kept telling everyone, don't worry, fraud is 1% for the last 10 years straight, right? When you do that, if anybody asks what's the fraud rate, you say, oh, don't worry, these guys said it's 1%. So don't worry, keep spending, right? So you see how there's a whole industry built around maintaining the status quo. And that's how ad fraud and all these other problems with digital marketing just proliferated since the advent of ad exchanges.
Okay, that makes sense. So given your pedigree, you've been around since multiple decades, since I was a little boy before I even got on the internet. But with the way the internet has changed tremendously since you first started, has there ever been any kind of fraud that you still feel like persists today since the early days of the Wild West to 2026?
Yeah, it's all the same. None of it's been stopped. There are still websites that are completely fake websites. And we went through cycles like the 2016 election, 2020 election, where bad guys were also putting up sites that had fake news. They had deliberate disinformation. And the way it connects to digital advertising is now these fake news and disinformation sites have a new source of revenue, advertising. So now they can make money and continue to expand their disinformation operations. And this was so easy that foreign actors, nation states, foreign governments could get in on this, right? They might as well make some of this money because it's big, gullible advertisers spending all this money without actually knowing where their ads are going and where their dollars are going, right? So you might as well take it. I have an article where I drew this header graphic where it's a pot of gold sitting by the roadside with the cover off, right? It's literally a pot of gold sitting there waiting for you to take. And every year, at least here in the US, advertisers refill that pot of gold with $300 billion of digital ad budgets. So it's a constant pot of gold that's just sitting there for you to take. It's so trivial. And why wouldn't bad actors, nation states, governments, cyber criminals, organizations get in on just taking that money? That's what's funded all the cybercrime that we've seen over the last decade.
Okay, so with that in mind, like all the fear about like AI increasing fraud, is it overblown? Because it seems like the one that's currently still present since forever is still around. And it just seems like the simplistic version of fraud, right? Yeah.
It is really hard to believe when I say AI is really not going to do much more, because if you really understand the fraud, like the way I've studied it, if you acknowledge that 90% of the stuff you bought over the last 10 years was already fake and fraudulent, meaning fake websites with fake traffic, i.e. bot traffic, then AI is just adding 1 or 2 more percent to it, right? It's just kind of democratizing the fraud even further, because now you don't need to know how to code. You don't even know how to put up a WordPress site. You can just let AI do that for you. So it's now just made the fraud even more accessible and doable by people with no technical skills, no coding experience or anything. But previous to that, there were entire pieces of software you could just go download. There was one called Website Generator, and that would just basically generate the WordPress sites for you. But you had to figure out, oh, can I host it on GoDaddy or something? So there's still some pieces now that those remaining barriers have been removed. So AI is incrementally making it easier, because now you don't have to go plagiarize the content. You can just have the AI generate the content. And in fact, in some of our recent campaigns for clients, we've noticed a surge in generated recipe sites, right? AI generated recipe sites. And you might wonder why recipes. It's because those recipe sites don't have keywords like war or shooting or bombing or Iran. So they make it through the brand safety filters like that. And the bad guys can start making money today, the same day. So Yes, AI is involved, but it's not going to significantly make the fraud larger because the fraud was already so large, right? That's the point that I want to make.
Yeah.
But if an advertiser runs their due diligence, hey, this is not what's best for my client, but still some fraud may happen at the end of the day. How can pixel attribution actually break from a technical perspective?
Yeah, so let me now tie those two things together, right? So there's fraud in the ads themselves, where the ads are loaded by bots as opposed to humans, software programs as opposed to humans. But the attribution fraud is a slightly different issue. Those actually have to involve humans because humans are the ones that make purchases. Okay, so the attribution fraud is simply about claiming credit for purchases that had already occurred or that would have occurred anyway without the advertising. Let me use a simple story to illustrate. I'm going to talk about footfall. Okay, so footfall means someone walking into a store. So, for example, if someone walks into a Dunkin' Donuts, a Taco Bell, a 7-Eleven, that's footfall. So I'll pose this as a question, but I'll give the answer shortly. But how would ad tech companies game footfall, right? There were a bunch of these location-based ad tech companies that said, oh, you don't have to pay for the ad impression. You don't even have to pay for the click. You only pay us when someone actually walks into your store. Okay, you would think that is the ultimate performance, right? I don't have to pay for any of the ads or the clicks. That's great. I only pay when someone actually walks into my store. What could be better? So my question for the audience is think about this for 15 seconds is how do you think ad tech companies can game even that, right? The footfall did occur, just like the sales did occur, right? The point I'm going to reveal in just 10 seconds is that they're simply claiming credit for it in the dashboards and the reports. So how do you think it happens for footfall?
Depending on the company, because I dealt with the mobile advertisers ID and tracking traffic from billboards to actual stores, is you actually ask your client, hey, can you give us your sales data? Can you give us your Google Ads data so we can match
Yeah.
everything? And
Yes, that's partly the way there. But let me close the loop for you. The answer is pixel attribution. Okay, so the way it occurs is one of the vendors we actually caught doing the following. They would buy very low cost mobile ads, so these tiny banners that are 320 by 50. And when the banner loads, the pixel attribution pixel loads, right? So what they're doing is they're marking that device as exposed to the ad. So if they marked 350 million devices in the US as exposed, meaning every single mobile device in the US as exposed, then whenever any one of those devices walks into a Dunkin' Donuts, they can claim credit for it, right? So when that pixel attribution fires, they collect the device ID, some mobile identifier, or they might set a cookie. They probably can't set the cookie these days because of third-party cookies being deprecated or whatever, but they'll somehow identify that device as exposed. So when that device walks into the polygon, which they drew around the Dunkin' Donuts location or the Taco Bell location, that device walked in, that was footfall. So now they could claim credit for the footfall, even if that person goes to Dunkin' Donuts every morning anyway. Okay. So that's just to illustrate how attribution can be gamed and how the vendors or platforms can claim credit for even footfall, something that occurred offline. You see how it's all just a matter of the reporting. Now, a very easy way for an advertiser to check if that's happening to them is basically add up all of the attributed sales from the different platforms that you use. Okay, so say, for example, you use YouTube, you use Google Search, you use Instagram ads, and maybe TikTok, okay, just to say 4. And then you look at the actual sales that occurred in that time period, say 1 quarter. Okay, say, I'm just going to use round numbers. Your own books tell you actually achieved 1,000 sales in that 1 quarter. When you take the numbers from these 4 platforms and you add it all up, you'll see that the number is 4,000. Okay, because each of the platforms claimed credit for the sales, the same sale, right? So now each platform claiming credit for 1,000 sales, when you have 4 different platforms, when you add together, it's 4,000 sales. You only physically got 1,000. Okay, so that's how you can tell when attribution, not necessarily fraud, it's simply a flaw in the way they do the attribution. right? When the pixel fires, they'll say in the next 30, 60, or 90 days, if a sale occurred, oh, that sale was caused by our ad. So every platform is now claiming credit for the same sale. Okay, so that's how the flaws in the pixel attribution method are revealed. And that's why very often you're seeing campaigns perform way better than the reality of it, right? That's the problem.
Now, a lot of our audience are lawyers, investors, CFOs, and they're not really technical people in the ad world. They have some business implications if they rely only on pixel attribution. Other than contacting you, what are ways they could make sense easily of dashboards and know which one actually tells the truth?
Yeah. So a very simple way to do this and run the experiment yourself is what I've historically called turn off experiments. Okay. So I think we mentioned this earlier with the eBay case, where when they turn off ad spending in a particular region, they saw that the traffic didn't change, the sales didn't change. Okay. So let me use two concepts to illustrate this. One is the velocity of traffic to your site, and the second is the velocity of sales on your site. Say you're, for example, you're an e-commerce provider. So when I use the term velocity, it just means the number of sales per time period. Okay, so say you have 100 sales per month. The next month you have about 100 sales per month. Okay, that's the velocity of sales that you're used to seeing on your website. If you turn on digital marketing, hopefully that velocity goes up, right? You might see 120 sales per month. Then you know the advertising working. Conversely, if you're currently running advertising, you might want to run that turn off experiment, but maybe not across everything, right? So just use the US as an example. You don't turn off advertising in the entire US, right? You still want sales, but you turn off advertising in one state like Texas. And then you look at the velocity of sales and whether that changed from the visitors coming from Texas. Okay. So that way you can start to tell whether a certain type of ad or certain channel like search ads versus YouTube versus Instagram is actually driving those sales that are happening on your site. So again, you don't need any special technology. You don't need any expert person. You don't need modeling or MTA modeling or all that kind of stuff. Marketing should be very basic, should be very common sense. Run those turn off experiments or run those turn on experiments and see if anything changed. See if the velocity changed, whether it's the traffic to your website or your sales. And we actually ran this in Australia, right? In Australia, there's 5 main cities and regions. So we did this for even TV, right? TV ads and billboards. Those were completely not attributable because there was not anything digital that you click or whatever. So what we did is we basically did a turn off experiment in one of the big cities. And we looked at the velocity of both traffic and sales occurring on that tourism site. And that's how we could say, okay, yeah, TV is actually working. Yeah, billboards are actually working because when we did away with those, when we did away with the TV ad spending, the velocity from that particular region of both traffic and sales went down. Okay, then you know it works. Okay. So again, I'm just using this as a kind of a simplistic way of saying you don't need any special technology. You don't need any special modeling algorithms or mathematicians to help you out with this, especially small businesses. I'm a small business owner. If I spend $100 on digital advertising and I don't get any sales from it, I can't afford to spend the next $100, right? Think the local barbershop, the local restaurant or whatever. Anyone can run these experiments yourself, right? So that way you can actually truly see if your digital advertising driving incremental sales for you.
Okay, that makes
And
sense. So just in terms of the turn off experiment, which is pretty easy to do, right? Just a little flip of the switch. What's the kind of time frame that you recommend for someone to run that just to get a good baseline sense of how impactful it is?
It's going to be dependent on your industry and your particular type of business, right? So a barbershop is not going to see that much traffic on their site, even if they have a website, right? Whereas a big DTC company, direct to consumer company, seeing millions of visits on their site. So again, it kind of depends on your particular situation, but just run it long enough for you to see a change, right? So when you make a change, in order to see the cause and effect, you have to run it for long enough. So I typically recommend kind of doing both ways. So it's turn it off, leave it for a little bit, turn it back on, turn it off again, and turn it back on, because you need to see those stair steps, right? That's going to be definitive proof that there was cause and effect between the digital ad spending and your sales. Just one off is not going to be enough. Could be a fluke. So I'm a scientist by training. I have my PhD from MIT. So it's show me the data, show me the evidence, and keep running experiments yourself. And don't just run it one time. You need to do it a few times so you can actually corroborate the results, right? And you can do that yourself. You don't need someone else to do that for you.
No, that's awesome.
Going back to our podcast audience, what are specific points that they should pay attention to? Let's say they have an advertiser running their ads. What are like fraud tactics or patterns they should be wary of and look out for?
I would just say a generalization, which is, I always like to say, don't trust, always verify. The previous variation of that is trust but verify. But it's like these days, anything in digital, you just shouldn't trust to begin with, right? Unless you can see the data, unless you can run your own experiments, you don't trust it until you can see the evidence. So I think in this case, same thing, whether it's traffic to your site or actual sales. I would say sales is better because traffic to your site could be easily faked. They could send a whole bunch of bots to your site and make it look like you have a bunch of traffic. Okay. So again, that's where my platform comes in, right? Foo Analytics is used by a lot of advertisers. I use it, and I built it because I just couldn't trust anyone else's data. And to be more specific, Google Analytics, it's not that they were doing anything wrong. It's just that they were required to filter out the bot traffic, right? So according to the IAB, this industry trade body, these platforms have to filter out the list of bots and spiders that the IAB puts out, right? So when Google Analytics does that, it actually creates more of a problem, because if you can't see the bots that are hitting your site just because they filtered it out and didn't display it, that's actually more of a problem in my mind, because actually I want to see where the bots are coming from. If the bots are actually coming from a paid marketing campaign, I know I need to go do something about it. If the bots are simply hitting my site but not coming from a paid campaign, okay, I don't have to worry about it, right? Because they're just hitting my page. It's not costing me my ad dollars. So in fact, I want to see the bot traffic hitting my site. So again, that's why I built Foo Analytics, because we record everything. We don't discard anything like GA does. So very often site owners are putting Foo Analytics next to Google Analytics so that they can actually troubleshoot their bot traffic, because they just can't see it in GA. And they see some kind of discrepancy that they can't explain. So by adding Foo Analytics, we give them enough analytical detail so they can say, oh, it's this bot and it's just hitting my page directly versus ones that are clicking through from my paid campaigns. If they are, then I need to go make some adjustments on those campaigns. So that's kind of the evidence-based route that I would recommend.
And I want to circle back for a second. Earlier, you mentioned that there's some legacy verification companies that are very content with the status quo. What are signs of a legacy verification company versus one that isn't for the status quo and actually wants to make the digital ad ecosystem better?
Yeah, it's very simple. You just ask them to show you the data, show you the supporting data. Right. So typically when you use one of these, and they're going to go unnamed because we all know who they are. But basically, when you ask them, why did you mark that as a bot? Or why did you not mark that as a bot? They say, oh, we can't tell you because we don't want the bad guys to find out. Okay. If they don't tell you anything, if they don't show you any data, there's no reason for you to trust them. Right. So when I first started out 15 years ago doing this, which is Foo Analytics, there was a conflict that I couldn't work out, which is if I became a fraud detection tech company, like those verification vendors that we're talking about, I would want fraud to continue so I can keep getting paid to detect it. Okay. I said, that doesn't make any sense. I'm a digital marketer first and foremost. I want to solve fraud. So it doesn't make sense for me to be a fraud detection company that relies on fraud to continue. So 15 years ago, for the lack of a better term, I called myself an ad fraud researcher. And my job at the time was to go audit campaigns for large advertisers, small advertisers, whatever, and use my tech to collect the data. Because again, GA doesn't provide that level of data, and the platforms that you buy from may not as well. So we had to collect our own data so that we could actually see what was going on. But over the course of 15 years, my role has revealed itself and the revenue model has revealed itself. We are an analytics platform that gives you the supporting details. Right. So unlike the fraud verification companies where they say they can't explain it to you, Our job is to explain it to you so that you can see the details and you can understand why something was fraudulent or bought, or why it wasn't fraudulent or bought. So let me give you two quick examples to illustrate. When we see clicks on our website, but we see no touch events on the phone, right? So if a person's holding a smartphone, in order for a human to click something, they actually have to touch the screen. So if we see clicks without corresponding touch events, we know a human couldn't have done it. Okay. So that's what I mean by the supporting data that we show in Foo Analytics, so that when we label something as a bot click, you understand why we labeled it as a bot click. On the flip side, for humans, we also positively measure for humans. None of the other verification companies do that, right? They just say IVT or not, invalid traffic or not. They don't actually measure for humans. They just let you assume that the other 99% was humans, but that's actually not a good assumption. But we positively measure for humans. And let me again use a very simplistic example to illustrate. If there is a form on your site that you have to fill out, a human would actually have to move their mouse to one of the fields, click the cursor to place the cursor, and then they have to have some keyboard events to type something. So for a human, when we see those events, we can say, okay, yeah, that makes sense. That's a human actually completing the form. If we see a form that has 20 fields completed and submitted in 1 second with no touch events, no keyboard events, a human couldn't have done it. So again, that's the level of supporting details that we show in the analytics platform, not a verification platform, right? So in this case, just like you would not rip out Google Analytics if you don't have a bot problem on your website, you wouldn't take out Foo Analytics from your ads, right? You want it to continue to measure your ad to make sure you're getting what you paid for, right? It's an analytics platform that you want always on, so that it's part of your governance, right? So that you can actually say, okay, I paid for this. Did I get what I paid for? That's kind of how you think about an analytics platform as opposed to fraud detection. You don't need fraud detection anymore if fraud is solved, but you do need analytics so that you can actually see what you're getting. And that's how you can monitor and govern your digital campaigns better.
And for my last question today, I want to also circle back to a point you made earlier in the show about those fake websites that are built for advertising. For people that don't know, we call those MFA, made for advertising. What are some specific ways advertisers can detect, like, hey, the ads I'm serving on this campaign, they might be going to an MFA website?
Yeah, it should also be very simple to understand. It should be common sense. If you go to a website and you see no ads on it and it's listed in your place reports, okay, something's wrong with that. If you go to a website and 50 ads on the page, something's wrong with that, right? If you go to a site and they do slideshows and you have 8 ads around the slideshow, you click the next slide and there's 8 more ads that come. So again, it should be that obvious. And furthermore, if you have never heard of that site before, that's a problem. Because if you haven't heard of it, other humans haven't heard of it. So there's not going to be a whole bunch of humans going to that site. So people talk about the long tail. That was okay in theory. But again, I call it the myth of the long tail, right? A lot of people believe that you can have sizable quantity or scale or reach in the long tail. But again, if you think about your own habits, I might visit a recipe site once to look up a particular recipe for a beef Wellington or something. I may never go back to that site again. Okay. So in that case, yes, niche content will draw niche audiences, but that's the key word. It's niche, right? It's not scale. It's not mass. So in this case, if you haven't heard of a site or a mobile app for that matter, most other people have not either. So most of the humans, the large majority of humans, go to a small handful of sites. I, in fact, ran this experiment in class. So I teach a digital marketing class. And I just asked the students, name 10 websites that you visit every single day as fast as you can, right? Just write it down. And basically, they can rattle off 5 or 6 or 7. But by the time they get to 7 or 8, they start slowing down because they don't regularly visit more than 10 to 15 sites per day. Again, they may visit long tail sites once in a while, okay? But again, they don't go back regularly. Same thing for mobile apps. Name 10 mobile apps that you use every single day, go. They will start slowing down after 5 or 6 or 7. So again, that's just a way to illustrate that a lot of humans go to a small number of sites. Those are the places you want your ads to be so that you can get your ads in front of humans. And just to close this loop on humans, fraud, and bots and attribution, first order of business in digital marketing is to show your ads to humans. Because if you don't show your ads to humans, none of the other stuff we talked about, like attribution, sales, and conversions, none of that matters, because you're not going to get any of it if you didn't show your ads to humans in the first place.
This has just been like fantastic, right? It's not every day that we get someone with a PhD from MIT and a meme page in the same room. So this has been a pretty fun conversation. Yeah. There's
Very
a lot
cool.
of good stuff from this too for the advertising crowd too. I think like everyone's going to probably want to keep a closer eye on the spike or anomalistic patterns in fraud during Q4, because that's where majority of the money's at, right? So yeah.
Yep. If they want to reach out, I'm always on LinkedIn. Just Google my name or send me an email, augustine.fu@fu.com. Happy to answer any follow-up questions from the crowd.
Absolutely.
Well, you answered my last question.
All right.
Thank you again, Dr. Fu, for joining us.
Thank you, Bogdan. Thank you, Chad.
It's been a great show. We're always happy to hear you speak, because when you post on LinkedIn, it's always very opinionated, very precise. And every time I followed you for the last 2-3 years, I've always learned something new.